August 2011, southern Afghanistan. The mountains were still black against the horizon when the Taliban lookout raised his radio and whispered urgently into the microphone. Movement in the fields, multiple shadows. For a moment there was silence on the other end of the line. Then the voice of his commander came back, sharp and tense. "Can you identify them?" The lookout squinted into the darkness. The shapes moved slowly through the irrigation ditches outside the village. Whoever they were, they moved with unusual patience, stopping, waiting, then sliding forward again. "No vehicles," the lookout said. "No lights." Another pause. Then the commander spoke again, this time with a completely different tone. "Leave the position." "What?" "Leave. Now." The young fighter hesitated. The village compound behind him held weapons, ammunition, and several men sleeping inside. Abandoning it, without a fight, went against everything he had been taught. "Why?" he asked. The reply came immediately. "Those are the Australians." The radio went silent. The lookout didn't argue. Within seconds he was already climbing down from the rooftop and running into the darkness beyond the village. He never fired a shot. And he wasn't the only one. Across large parts of southern Afghanistan, insurgent fighters had learned a simple rule: if the Australians were nearby, you left. Not because they had more men, not because they had bigger weapons, but because they fought in a way that made even experienced fighters feel hunted. And in war, fear spreads faster than bullets. By the summer of 2011, the war in Afghanistan had already lasted almost a decade. Coalition forces had deployed more than 130,000 troops across the country. Soldiers from dozens of nations operated in the mountains, deserts, and villages. The largest contingents came from the United States, Britain, Canada, and several NATO partners. Convoys of armored vehicles rolled through dusty roads every day. Helicopters thundered overhead. Massive bases surrounded by concrete walls dominated the landscape. From a distance, it looked like overwhelming military power. But the reality on the ground was different. The Taliban had spent nearly 10 years adapting. They learned exactly how coalition forces operated. They studied patrol routes. They tracked response times for helicopters. They memorized the rules of engagement that required positive identification before firing. Most importantly, they controlled the flow of information in their own territory. Local villagers watched the roads, children counted military vehicles, farmers used mobile phones to report movements. In many districts, insurgent commanders knew when a NATO patrol left its base before the soldiers themselves reached the village. It was a war of patience and adaptation. And by 2010, the Taliban had become very good at surviving it. Coalition patrols often followed predictable patterns. Armored vehicles would leave a forward operating base in the morning. They would drive along known routes between villages. At some point, usually from a distance of several hundred meters, Taliban fighters would open fire. The ambush rarely lasted long. Coalition forces would return fire and call for air support. Within 15 minutes, attack helicopters would arrive. By then, the insurgents had already disappeared into orchards, irrigation tunnels, or nearby villages. Then everything reset. The same patrols, the same routes, the same ambushes, over and over again. It became a grinding stalemate. Coalition forces possessed overwhelming firepower, but the enemy controlled the terrain and the population. The Taliban could choose when and where to fight. Most of the time, they chose not to fight at all. Instead, they planted roadside bombs. Improvised explosive devices became the deadliest weapon of the war. Hidden beneath dirt roads or buried inside culverts, these bombs destroyed armored vehicles and killed soldiers who never even saw their enemy. Every month, the casualty numbers climbed. Every year, the insurgents became more experienced. And yet, in one particular region of the country, something unusual began to happen. Attacks were decreasing, not everywhere, only in specific districts. Intelligence analysts studying battlefield reports noticed a strange pattern. Wherever a certain small unit operated, insurgent activity dropped dramatically. Ambushes stopped, bomb networks disappeared, local commanders avoided entire valleys. At first, analysts thought it was coincidence, but the pattern repeated again and again. Eventually, intercepted Taliban communications revealed the reason. Insurgent leaders were warning their fighters about a particular group of soldiers, a very small group. The unit was known informally among coalition forces as Task Group Ironwood. Officially, it was part of Australia's Special Operations deployment in Afghanistan. The operators belonged to an elite regiment formed decades earlier during the Cold War. The regiment was small, intentionally so. At any given time, only a few hundred commandos served in its operational squadrons. Their selection process lasted nearly 2 years. Most candidates never finished it. The training was designed to eliminate anyone who could not operate independently under extreme pressure. Physical endurance was only part of it. Candidates also had to demonstrate navigation skills, patience, discipline, and the ability to function in small teams far from support. Those who passed were trained for missions that required absolute precision. By the time they arrived in Afghanistan, many of these operators had already spent years mastering their craft. But what truly separated them from other units wasn't just training. It was how they deployed. Most NATO forces rotated through different areas of Afghanistan every few months. A battalion might spend 6 months in one province before moving somewhere completely new. The Australian commandos did something different. They returned to the same districts again and again. One deployment, then another, then another. Some operators served in the same valleys 4 or 5 times. Over time, they learned every ridge, riverbed, and footpath. They memorized the layout of villages. They recognized which compounds belonged to which families. They knew where fighters usually placed observation posts. In a war where local knowledge was everything, that experience became a powerful advantage. But the real difference was how they moved. Most coalition forces traveled in armored vehicles. These commandos preferred to walk for days at a time. Small patrols of 4 or 5 men would move through mountains and farmland without resupply. They carried only what they needed: water, ammunition, minimal equipment. They avoided roads. They avoided electronic signals whenever possible. They moved slowly, carefully, and often at night. To insurgent spotters watching from villages, they were almost impossible to track. Sometimes they appeared suddenly in places where no patrol had been seen leaving a base. Sometimes they stayed hidden for days before striking. The effect was unsettling. Taliban fighters were used to predictable enemies: convoys, large patrols, helicopter assaults. These men operated differently. They moved quietly through the same terrain insurgents believed they controlled. And when they struck with precision, usually against specific individuals, bomb makers, cell leaders, commanders. The result was a reputation that spread quickly across insurgent networks. Stories began circulating between villages and training camps. Stories about soldiers who could walk through the night without being seen. Soldiers who appeared inside compounds without warning. Soldiers who fought at distances so close that escape became almost impossible. Within months, fighters started referring to them with a nickname: ghosts. And in one remote valley during the summer of 2011, that reputation was about to grow even stronger. Because intelligence had just identified a man responsible for coordinating dozens of roadside bomb attacks. He operated from a fortified compound near a small village deep inside insurgent-controlled territory. Capturing him would disrupt an entire network. But reaching him meant entering a valley where several previous coalition operations had already failed. It was a place where every approach was watched, every road was mined, and every stranger was reported. Conventional forces had tried to clear the area twice. Both attempts ended with heavy fighting and no lasting results. Now a small team from Task Group Ironwood received the mission. 4 operators, 1 target, and an approach that no one else had tried before. The plan would require patience, stealth, and a willingness to walk straight into the heart of enemy territory. Because this time, the ghosts weren't just passing through the valley. They were going inside. The valley of Direct lay several hours south of the nearest coalition base. From the air it looked peaceful. A thin river cut through the center, feeding rows of orchards and small farms. Mud brick villages dotted the green zone along the water, while steep, rocky ridges rose sharply on both sides. But to soldiers who had fought there, Direct was one of the most dangerous districts in the entire province. For years, it had served as a corridor for insurgent movement between mountain hideouts and the larger towns further south. Weapons moved through the valley. Fighters passed through it. Bomb components were assembled inside its compounds and then sent toward the highways used by coalition convoys. Every attempt to control the valley had run into the same problem. The Taliban saw everything. Spotters sat on hilltops during the day and rooftops at night. Local sympathizers reported strangers immediately. If a convoy approached along the main road, word reached the fighters long before the vehicles arrived. By the time soldiers entered a village, the men they were looking for were already gone. For conventional units, the valley was almost impossible to dominate. For Task Group Ironwood, that challenge was exactly the point. Inside a quiet planning room at the coalition base, a map of Direct Valley covered the wall. 4 operators studied it in silence. Their patrol leader, a staff sergeant named Daniel Mercer, had deployed to Afghanistan 3 times already. This would be his 4th rotation into the same district. He knew the terrain well enough that he rarely needed the map. Across from him sat Lucas Reed, the team's communication specialist. Reed handled radios, satellite links, and the encrypted systems that allowed the patrol to talk to aircraft when necessary. The 3rd man, Aaron Holt, was the patrol medic and second in command. Holt had a calm, almost quiet personality that balanced Mercer's more direct leadership style. The fourth operator was Nathan Cole, the team's designated marksman. Cole was responsible for long-range observation and covering fire if the situation turned violent. 4 men. That was the entire assault element. For many special operations units, even a simple raid involved a dozen operators supported by helicopters and drones. This team would operate differently. The target was a bomb network coordinator known locally as Hassan Qadir. Coalition intelligence believed he controlled several small groups responsible for building and placing improvised explosive devices across the province. Over the previous year, those bombs had destroyed multiple vehicles and killed several coalition soldiers. Qadir rarely traveled during the day. Instead, he stayed inside a heavily guarded compound near the village of Mirabad, deep inside the Darakht Valley. Several armed fighters protected the location, and local villagers served as an early warning system. Any large military force approaching the village would be detected immediately. That meant a conventional raid, helicopters, armored vehicles, or large patrols would almost certainly fail. By the time the troops arrived, Qadir would already be gone. The only realistic option was stealth. Mercer studied the terrain around Mirabad carefully. The compound sat in a dangerous position. High ridges overlooked the surrounding farmland. Narrow irrigation channels crisscrossed the fields. Several small footpaths connected the village to nearby settlements. From a defensive perspective, it was ideal. From an attacker's perspective, it was a trap. Any approach during daylight would expose a patrol to observation from multiple directions. Night offered the only real chance, but even that carried risks. Temperatures in the valley during summer often reached extreme levels during the day, and the heat remained oppressive well into the night. Operators moving through the terrain had to carry enough water to survive several days without resupply. Communications were another problem. Radio signals bounced unpredictably between the ridges. Sometimes they worked perfectly. Sometimes they disappeared entirely. If the team ran into trouble, calling for help could take time. And help itself might take even longer to arrive. The nearest quick reaction force was stationed nearly 40 minutes away by helicopter. For a small patrol operating deep inside insurgent territory, that was a long time. The plan Mercer eventually proposed was simple. Simple, but difficult. The team would insert several kilometers away from the village by helicopter late in the evening. From there, they would move on foot. Slowly, carefully. They would avoid roads and travel through terrain that insurgent spotters were less likely to watch. The journey would take at least 2 nights. During the day, they would remain hidden in concealed observation positions. Once near Mirabad, they would observe the compound for as long as necessary. Hours, maybe an entire day. The goal was to confirm Qadir's presence and understand the routines of the guards before making any move. Only after that would Mercer decide how to approach the objective. The other operators listened quietly. None of them asked the obvious question: what happens if things go wrong? They all already knew the answer. They would handle it themselves. The helicopter insertion happened shortly after sunset. The aircraft flew low across the mountains before dropping the team onto a small patch of rocky ground several kilometers north of the valley. The moment the helicopter disappeared into the darkness, the world became silent again. No engines, no artificial lights, just the faint sound of wind moving through dry grass. Mercer checked his compass and adjusted his pack. Let's move. The patrol began walking. Moving through the mountains at night required patience. Each operator carried nearly 30 kilograms of equipment: water, ammunition, medical supplies, communications gear. Even so, their loads were lighter than those carried by conventional soldiers. They moved in single file along narrow animal paths and dry stream beds. Every few minutes, Mercer would pause, listening carefully. If anyone in the valley below had heard them, it never showed. Hours passed. The team descended gradually toward the green farmland along the river. Around midnight, they reached a series of orchards outside the valley. Here they slowed even further. Trees provided cover, but they also concealed irrigation ditches that could easily twist an ankle in the dark. Reed checked their navigation quietly. 2 kilometers to the observation point. Mercer nodded. Keep moving. They reached their first hide site shortly before dawn. The position lay on a small ridge overlooking farmland, leading toward Mirabad village. From here, they could see the faint outlines of several compounds through their optics. Mercer scanned the area carefully. Nothing moved. One by one, the operators concealed themselves beneath camouflage nets and natural vegetation. The goal was simple: remain invisible. During daylight hours, the valley would come alive. Farmers would work their fields. Children would move between houses. Spotters might scan the hills for anything unusual. If even one person noticed something out of place, the mission could collapse instantly. So the team waited. Hour after hour, watching, recording, learning the rhythm of the village. As the sun climbed higher, Mirabad slowly came to life. Men walked between compounds. A few motorcycles appeared on the dirt paths. Women carried water from nearby wells. Nothing about the village looked unusual. But through high-powered optics, the operators began noticing details. Armed men moving in and out of a particular compound. Guards rotating positions. Rifles leaning against a wall near one entrance. By late afternoon, Mercer had little doubt. They had found Qadir's compound. Now the real challenge remained: getting inside it, without the entire valley waking up. And for that, the ghosts would have to move even closer. Darkness returned slowly to the Direct Valley. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, long shadows stretched across the orchards and irrigation fields surrounding the village of Mirabad. Farmers finished their work and returned to their compounds. Small cooking fires flickered in courtyards. Voices echoed briefly between mud brick walls before fading into the quiet of the night. From their hidden position on the ridge, the 4 operators of Task Group Ironwood watched everything. For nearly 12 hours they had studied the compound where Hassan Qadir was believed to be staying. They counted the guards. They tracked their movements. They observed which doors were used and which remained closed. Patterns slowly revealed themselves. 2 armed men usually stood watch near the front entrance after sunset. Another guard moved between the outer wall and a small storage building near the courtyard. Inside the compound, there were at least 3 separate rooms used for sleeping. Mercer lowered his binoculars and glanced at the others. "He's there," he said quietly. No one asked how he knew. After hours of observation, the answer was obvious. Now came the hardest part: getting close enough. The patrol began moving shortly after midnight. They left the ridge slowly, descending toward the farmland below. The terrain between them and the village was a maze of irrigation channels, low stone walls, and narrow crop rows. Every step had to be placed carefully. Loose stones could shift, dry branches could snap, any sudden noise might alert the nearby compounds. The operators moved one at a time, pausing frequently to listen. The village itself was less than 500 meters away. From this distance they could hear dogs barking somewhere beyond the houses. A faint smell of wood smoke drifted through the cool night air. Mercer signaled for the team to stop. Ahead of them stood the outer wall of the compound they had been watching all day. It was made of thick mud brick, hardened by years of sun. From the outside it looked smooth, but Mercer knew that small cracks and uneven surfaces could provide enough grip to climb. First, they needed to deal with the guards. Through night optics, Cole spotted 2 men sitting near the entrance gate. Both carried rifles. Both appeared relaxed. They probably believed the valley around them was secure. Mercer studied the layout again. The guards were positioned only a few meters apart. Attempting to eliminate them silently from a distance would risk alerting the entire compound. So Mercer chose another option: avoid them completely. He motioned for the team to move along the base of the wall instead. They approached slowly, staying low against the mud bricks. The guards remained less than 10 meters away. The Australians could hear them speaking quietly in Pashto. One of the men lit a cigarette, the brief glow of the lighter illuminating his face for a moment. Neither guard looked in their direction. The operators continued sliding along the wall until they reached a section partially hidden by a stack of wooden crates. Mercer touched the wall with his hands, feeling the surface. There, small cracks, enough to climb. One by one, the operators pulled themselves upward, boots finding narrow ledges in the rough brick. No ropes, no climbing gear, just careful movement. Mercer reached the top first. He paused briefly, listening. The courtyard below appeared quiet. He lowered himself silently inside. The others followed. Within seconds, all 4 operators stood inside the compound. The air inside the courtyard was thick and warm. Several small buildings surrounded the open space. A few dim lanterns burned near doorways, casting weak pools of light across the ground. Mercer signaled the team into position. Cole moved toward a shadowed corner where he could watch the courtyard. Reed remained near the wall to maintain communication with their overwatch systems. Mercer and Holt approached the first room. The wooden door creaked slightly as Mercer pushed it open. Inside, 2 men slept on thin mats placed directly on the floor. Their rifles rested against the wall beside them. Mercer moved quickly. He pressed a hand over the mouth of the nearest fighter, while Holt secured the second man before he could react. Within seconds, both were restrained with plastic ties. Neither made a sound. The operators moved to the next room. This one contained a single fighter. As Mercer stepped through the doorway, the man suddenly stirred. His eyes opened. For a fraction of a second, confusion crossed his face. Then he reached for the rifle, leaning beside him. Holt reacted instantly. He crossed the small space in 2 strides, driving the fighter to the floor and controlling his arms before the weapon could be raised. The struggle lasted only moments. The room fell silent again. 2 rooms cleared. One left. Mercer approached the final door carefully. Through the thin wooden panel, he could hear slow breathing inside. 3 people at least. Possibly more. He pushed the door open. Inside the room lay Hassan Qadir. Even in the dim light, Mercer recognized him from the intelligence photos. 2 armed bodyguards slept on either side of him. Their rifles rested within arm's reach. For several seconds, the Australians moved carefully into the room. Then one of the bodyguards opened his eyes. Everything changed instantly. The man grabbed for his rifle. Mercer fired. The suppressed pistol made a sharp, muffled crack. Holt fired a split second later. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 seconds. Both bodyguards collapsed before they could shout a warning. Qadir froze in shock as Mercer forced him onto the ground and secured his hands behind his back. For a moment, the compound remained silent. Then somewhere outside, a voice shouted. Someone had discovered the prisoners in the earlier room. The alarm spread quickly. Cole's voice came through the radio. "Movement outside. Multiple." Mercer pulled Qadir to his feet. "Time to go." The team exited the compound the same way they had entered, climbing the wall and dropping into the fields beyond. But now the valley was waking up. Lights flickered in nearby houses. Men shouted from rooftops. Gunfire cracked in the distance. The operators moved fast. They formed a tight defensive formation around their prisoner as they crossed the dark farmland toward their extraction point, nearly 400 meters away. Figures appeared ahead of them. Insurgent fighters moving through the fields. Cole fired first. His rifle flashed briefly in the darkness. One fighter dropped instantly. More shots followed from another direction. Bullets snapped through the crops. The Australians kept moving. Short, controlled bursts. Precise shots. Never stopping. Every few seconds, one operator turned to cover a different direction, while the others advanced. The technique kept them protected from all sides. Within minutes, they reached the open ground near their landing zone. The sound of helicopter blades echoed faintly in the distance. Reed signaled with an infrared marker. Moments later, the dark silhouette of the helicopter appeared above the fields. The aircraft touched down just long enough for the team to board. Rounds struck the ground nearby as insurgents fired from the edge of the village. Then the helicopter lifted back into the sky. 40 minutes after entering the valley, the ghosts were gone, and they had taken Hassan Qadir with them. The helicopter lifted silently into the night sky, carrying the 4 operators and their prisoner away from the Darak Valley. Below, the village remained in chaos. Shouts echoed between compounds. Weapons were fired sporadically. Yet by the time coalition reinforcements could arrive, the Australians had already vanished into the darkness. Back at the base, Hassan Qadir was interrogated under controlled conditions. Within 72 hours, he revealed the locations of 14 separate bomb-making cells. Entire networks responsible for planting improvised explosive devices across the province were disrupted. Lives were saved, both coalition soldiers and civilians. But the impact of the mission extended far beyond the numbers. Across Darak Valley, insurgent communications changed dramatically. Intercepted radio conversations revealed hesitation and fear. Mid-level commanders instructed fighters to avoid areas where Australian patrols were known to operate. New recruits deserted when they learned that SAS operators were active in their sector. The psychological effect was unmistakable. Colonel James Thornton, an American officer with the International Security Assistance Force, reviewed the data during a July 2010 briefing. "Whatever these Australians are doing," he said bluntly, "we need to document it. They're changing the battlefield with a handful of men." From 2007 to 2010, Task Group Ironwood and other Australian SAS squadrons conducted nearly 300 direct action missions. 41 involved sustained firefights. Remarkably, only 3 operators were wounded during that period, all of whom returned to duty. Not a single commando was killed in combat. Enemy casualties told a starkly different story. Documented insurgent deaths exceeded 400, with an additional 150 captured alive. The SAS operators' effectiveness stemmed from their unique approach. Unlike other NATO forces rotating units every few months, Australian commandos repeatedly returned to the same areas, learning terrain, villages, and networks intimately. They moved mostly on foot, carrying lighter loads, integrating with local populations to gather intelligence while conducting precise surgical operations. Their small numbers, patient intelligence work, and deep area knowledge created effects far beyond conventional expectations. Yet, their approach also carried costs. The intense autonomy and close-knit culture that produced such operational success sometimes fostered environments where accountability was difficult to enforce. By 2016, investigations into SAS deployments in Afghanistan uncovered credible evidence of unlawful actions by a small number of operators. The resulting report in 2020 identified 39 unlawful killings by 25 personnel. The findings led to unit-wide reforms, revocation of some awards, and criminal investigations, casting a shadow over the otherwise remarkable achievements. Still, the tactical innovations persisted. NATO and allied special operations forces, including the British SAS, American Special Forces, New Zealand SAS, and Canadian Special Operations, incorporated elements of the Australian approach. Emphasis on small team operations, extended duration foot patrols, minimal electronic signatures, and cultural integration became part of the doctrinal standard. A 2015 NATO study recognized light footprint, high-effect operations as the future of counterinsurgency, citing Australian practices as the model. In Perth, at Campbell Barracks, the home of the Australian SAS, a memorial wall honors 41 regiment members killed in action since Vietnam. 3 of those names are from Afghanistan, 2007 to 2013. There are no operational details, no medals listed, only names, ranks, and dates. Quiet professionalism, service without fanfare. The ethos remains intact. For the men of Task Group Ironwood, the impact of their service extended beyond medals or recognition. Sergeant Daniel Mercer returned home quietly after his 4th tour. He received the Medal for Gallantry in a private ceremony. He later became a wilderness guide in Tasmania, teaching survival skills to at-risk youth, passing on lessons of patience, courage, and resilience. Other team members followed similar paths, leaving behind the battlefield but carrying its lessons forward. The captured Taliban commander, Hassan Qadir, remained alive throughout. Once a school teacher turned bomb network leader after the death of his brother in an airstrike, he admitted later in interrogation, "I have fought Americans, British, Canadians. I was never afraid." But when I saw the Australians in my room in the dark, I knew I was already dead. His intelligence disrupted networks, saved lives, and for years became part of the strategic impact of small elite units. He was eventually transferred to Afghan custody and later released in a prisoner exchange. His fate after release remains unknown. By 2012, even insurgent manuals addressed the threat specifically posed by Australian forces. Avoid them, maintain observation only, retreat to prepared positions. Never engage unless absolutely necessary. The fear of these operators had become doctrine. In 2018, a retired SAS operator reflected in an interview, "We went there to fight the Taliban, and we did that well, maybe too well. We became so effective at killing and capturing that we forgot to ask whether what we were doing was building anything that would last." Fear doesn't build nations. It doesn't create peace. But it ensured survival for ourselves and for those we could protect. The ghosts had left Darak Valley. Their presence remained only in memory, in intercepted communications, and in the disrupted networks of insurgents. They had proven that small, disciplined teams, moving with patience, intelligence, and precision, could dominate battlefields far larger than themselves. But the war itself, with all its political, social, and cultural complexities, would continue long after the last helicopter lifted off. Australian SAS operators had changed the calculus of counterinsurgency. They had shown that fear, discipline, and knowledge could outweigh numbers and firepower. Yet, the ultimate lesson endured. Tactical brilliance alone cannot build peace. It can only create a window in which others must act. The valley would eventually return to silence. The men who haunted it were gone, but the legacy of their actions endured. A lesson in modern warfare for all who would follow.